When I first encountered the writings of the ancient philosophers in my early years, I noticed something troubling. The very foundations upon which modern civilization prized itself were crumbling, yet no one seemed to recognize the signs. In my decades of teaching at Chicago, I witnessed how the crisis of the West manifested not merely as political upheaval, but as something far more profound, the loss of our capacity to distinguish between noble and base, true and false, just and unjust. What we face today is not accidental, it is the inevitable result of philosophical choices made centuries ago. The ancient philosophers foresaw this precisely because they understood human nature in ways that modernity has forgotten. Through careful reading of classical texts, we can decode the warnings they left us and perhaps understand why our current predicament was not only predictable, but predicted. The collapse of moral authority, the triumph of relativism, the confusion of freedom with license, all of these phenomena were anticipated by thinkers who understood that abandoning the quest for transcendent truth inevitably leads to cultural disintegration. Yet within this crisis lies an opportunity for those willing to undertake the arduous journey back to the sources of genuine wisdom. Chapter 1: The Ancient Warning About Relativism's Inevitable Tyranny. When Protagoras declared that man is the measure of all things, Plato immediately recognized the dangerous implications hidden within this seemingly innocent proposition. In the Theaetetus, we witness Socrates methodically demonstrating how relativism, taken to its logical conclusion, destroys the very possibility of knowledge and, consequently, of justice itself. The ancient philosophers understood that once we abandon the quest for objective truth, we inevitably slide toward a condition where might makes right. But the sophistical argument was seductive precisely because it appeared to solve the problem of conflicting opinions by declaring all opinions equally valid. This is precisely what we observe in contemporary culture. The celebration of diverse perspectives and the insistence that all viewpoints are equally valid represents the triumph of Protagorean relativism over Platonic realism. But the ancients knew something we have forgotten. Relativism is not the friend of tolerance it pretends to be. Rather, it is the precursor to tyranny. When there are no objective standards of truth or justice, those with the most power inevitably impose their will upon others, justified by the very relativism that was supposed to protect minority viewpoints. Aristotle, in the Politics, shows us how this process unfolds with mathematical precision. When a society loses its shared understanding of the good life, it fragments into competing factions, each claiming equal legitimacy for their preferences. The result is not peaceful coexistence, but perpetual conflict that can only be resolved through force. Democratic deliberation becomes impossible when there are no common standards by which to evaluate competing claims. The ancient philosophers predicted our cultural crisis because they understood that human beings cannot live together in political community without some shared conception of justice, and justice requires objective standards that transcend individual opinion. The sophistical movement in ancient Athens provides an exact parallel to our contemporary intellectual landscape. Just as the sophists taught young Athenians that traditional beliefs were merely conventional arrangements that could be manipulated for personal advantage, our universities now teach students that Western civilization's achievements are nothing more than expressions of power disguised as truth. The sophists promise to make the weaker argument appear stronger through clever rhetoric. Our public intellectuals promise to deconstruct inherited wisdom to reveal its allegedly oppressive character. Yet observe the paradox that Plato identified and that remains with us today. Those who claim that all truths are relative immediately begin imposing their own absolute truths with remarkable intolerance. The relativist who insists that no culture is superior to any other becomes furiously dogmatic when confronted with cultures that reject relativism. This contradiction exposes the sophistical character of contemporary relativism. It is not a genuine philosophical position but a rhetorical weapon used to undermine traditional authorities while establishing new ones. The result, then as now, is the same. the corruption of education and the destruction of the philosophical spirit that seeks wisdom above all else. Students are taught to be suspicious of great texts and noble traditions, but they are given no positive vision of what human excellence might look like. They learn to critique but not to affirm, to deconstruct but not to build, to question everything except the very questioning that has made them incapable of genuine learning. Chapter 2: How Modernity's Rejection of Teleology Destroyed Culture. The great rupture occurred when modern philosophy decided that the ancients had been fundamentally mistaken about the nature of reality and human purpose. Machiavelli initiated this revolution by arguing that effective political action requires abandoning classical virtue in favor of what works. Hobbes followed by reducing human nature to self-preservation and material desire, explicitly rejecting the Aristotelian notion that human beings are naturally political animals oriented toward the good life. The Enlightenment completed the transformation by promising that human reason, freed from ancient superstitions, could construct a perfectly rational society based on individual rights and scientific method. But examine carefully what was lost in this transition. The ancients understood that human beings are naturally oriented towards something higher than themselves, whether we call it the good, God, or simply excellence. This teleological understanding of human nature is what makes genuine culture possible. Culture, in the classical sense, is the deliberate cultivation of human souls toward their highest possibilities. When modernity declared that such transcendent purposes were illusory, it inadvertently cut the roots of civilization itself. You cannot sustain a culture that tells its members their highest aspirations are meaningless projections of their own desires. The crisis we face today is the working out of this modern philosophical error across multiple generations. When Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God, he was simply making explicit what Enlightenment rationalism had already accomplished implicitly. But Nietzsche, unlike his more optimistic predecessors, understood the consequences. If there is no transcendent source of value, then nihilism is inevitable. The ancient philosophers would not have been surprised by this outcome because they never believed that human reason, operating alone and without reference to the cosmic order, could provide sufficient foundation for meaning and moral obligation. Consider how this manifests in contemporary education, which has become perhaps the clearest symptom of our cultural crisis. We teach students to be critical of traditional authorities but provide them with no positive vision of what human excellence might look like. We deconstruct inherited beliefs but offer no wisdom to replace them. We encourage critical thinking, but provide no criteria by which to distinguish better from worse ways of thinking. The result is precisely what Plato warned against in the Republic: souls that have been liberated from false opinions but given no guidance toward truth become confused, angry, and susceptible to demagoguery. The ancient understanding of education was fundamentally different because it was grounded in a teleological conception of human nature. Education aimed not merely at the transmission of information or even of skills, but at the formation of character and the development of wisdom. It assumed that human beings are naturally capable of recognizing and being attracted to what is truly good, beautiful, and just, but only if their souls are properly cultivated through sustained engagement with the highest exemplars of human achievement. Modernity's abandonment of this approach has produced what we might call educated barbarians, people who possess technical knowledge and sophisticated analytical skills but lack any sense of what life is for or what makes it worth living. They can deconstruct any tradition but cannot create anything worthy of preservation. They can criticize any authority but cannot recognize legitimate excellence when they encounter it. This is the cultural crisis the ancient philosophers predicted would result from abandoning the pursuit of wisdom in favor of the accumulation of mere information or the satisfaction of immediate desires. Chapter 3: The Collapse of Moral Authority and Its Democratic Consequences. Those of you who have seriously grappled with the classical texts will recognize that what we call moral authority today bears little resemblance to what the ancients understood by that term. For Plato and Aristotle, genuine authority derived from wisdom, the capacity to discern what is truly good for human beings and to embody that good in one's own life and character. Such authority was not imposed from without but recognized from within by souls capable of appreciating excellence. The philosopher king was not a tyrant who forced his will upon others, but a person of such evident wisdom and virtue that others naturally sought his guidance. Our contemporary crisis of authority stems directly from modernity's rejection of this classical understanding. When we decided that all moral claims are merely subjective preferences, expressions of individual will rather than discoveries of objective truth, we simultaneously destroyed the foundation upon which legitimate authority rests. If my values are no better than yours, and yours no better than anyone else's, then no one has the right to claim moral leadership over others. The result is what we observe everywhere around us: institutions that have lost their capacity to inspire respect or obedience, leaders who govern through manipulation rather than moral example, and citizens who oscillate between cynical withdrawal and fanatical attachment to ideological movements. But notice something crucial that the ancient philosophers understood: human beings cannot live without moral authority of some kind. The need for guidance about how to live is built into our nature as rational but finite beings who must make choices without complete knowledge of their consequences. When legitimate authority collapses, authority based on wisdom and virtue, it is inevitably replaced by illegitimate authority, the authority of force, manipulation, wealth, celebrity, or mass opinion. This is precisely what Plato predicted would happen in democratic societies that abandoned the pursuit of wisdom in favor of the pursuit of freedom understood as the satisfaction of desire. The phenomenon we call cancel culture represents exactly this dynamic. Having abandoned objective standards of truth and justice, we fall back on the crude authority of the mob. Those who control the mechanisms of public opinion, whether through traditional media, social media platforms, or academic institutions, become the new tyrants, imposing their will through social pressure, economic boycotts, and professional ostracism rather than through rational argument or moral persuasion. The ancients would have recognized this immediately as the rule of the many that Aristotle warned was one of the worst forms of government. What makes this particularly tragic is that the victims of such mob rule often include precisely those individuals who possess the intellectual and moral qualities that would make them capable of genuine leadership. The same dynamic that destroyed Socrates in ancient Athens, the resentment of the many toward those who challenge their comfortable prejudices, operates with even greater force in our mass democratic society. Excellence becomes a target for destruction rather than an object of admiration and emulation. Yet there remains hope, precisely because human nature itself has not changed. People still hunger for genuine moral guidance, even when they cannot articulate what they seek or when the culture tells them that such seeking is illegitimate. The task for those who understand the classical tradition is to demonstrate, through our own lives and teaching, what authentic moral authority looks like, authority based not on power or popularity, but on wisdom and virtue that can be recognized by anyone whose soul has not been completely corrupted by modern education and contemporary culture. This requires what the ancients called prudence, the practical wisdom to know not only what is true and good, but also how to communicate truth and goodness effectively in particular circumstances. Such prudence recognizes that not all truths can be spoken directly to all audiences, and that the art of moral education requires patience, subtlety, and deep understanding of human psychology. Chapter 4: The Technology Problem the Ancients Foresaw Through Human Nature. Although Plato and Aristotle could not have imagined smartphones, social media, or artificial intelligence, they understood something profound about the relationship between human nature and technological power that makes their insights remarkably relevant to our digital age. In the Phaedrus, Plato has Socrates warn that writing itself might weaken human memory and judgment by making us dependent on external aids rather than developing our internal capacities. If something as basic as written language posed dangers to the soul, What would the ancients have thought about technologies that promise to fulfill our every desire instantly and to connect us with unlimited information and entertainment? The fundamental issue is what Aristotle called the problem of unlimited appetite. Human beings naturally desire good things, knowledge, friendship, beauty, honor, pleasure. But without proper education and self-discipline, these natural desires become distorted into insatiable cravings that can never be satisfied. The healthy desire for knowledge becomes mere curiosity, the natural need for friendship becomes desperate seeking for approval, the appreciation of beauty becomes aesthetic gluttony, the pursuit of honor becomes vanity, the enjoyment of legitimate pleasures becomes addiction. Modern technology amplifies this problem exponentially by making it possible to pursue immediate gratification on a scale unprecedented in human history. Consider how this manifests in our relationship to information and knowledge. The internet promises unlimited access to human learning, but what we often get instead is unlimited access to opinion, gossip, propaganda, and distraction. The ancients understood that genuine knowledge requires sustained contemplation, dialogue with serious minds, and the patient development of intellectual virtues. Real learning is slow, difficult, and often painful because it requires us to abandon comfortable illusions and confront challenging truths. Our digital culture encourages the opposite: rapid consumption of bite-sized content that confirms our existing prejudices rather than challenging us to think more deeply or to question our fundamental assumptions. The political implications are severe and become more apparent each day. Democratic government presupposes citizens capable of rational deliberation about the common good. Such deliberation requires the ability to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information, to follow complex arguments over extended periods, to consider multiple perspectives fairly, and to subordinate immediate emotional reactions to long-term rational considerations. But if technology trains us to seek immediate emotional satisfaction rather than engage in patient reasoning, we become incapable of the kind of citizenship democracy requires. The result is what we observe everywhere in contemporary political life: discourse dominated by slogans, tribal loyalties, and manufactured outrage rather than serious consideration of complex issues. Citizens become consumers of political entertainment rather than participants in genuine deliberation. Politicians become performers rather than statesmen. Elections become contests between competing brands rather than choices between different visions of the common good. Yet the ancients also provide resources for addressing this crisis, precisely because they understood that the highest human activities are inherently resistant to technological acceleration. Philosophy, friendship, contemplation of truth and beauty, the cultivation of virtue, these goods cannot be mass-produced or consumed passively. They require time, patience, direct human contact, and the development of internal capacities that no external technology can provide. Perhaps our current crisis will force us to rediscover these ancient insights about what makes life truly worth living, as opposed to merely efficient or entertaining. The key is to recognize that technology is not neutral. Every technological innovation shapes the souls of those who use it, either promoting the development of human excellences or encouraging the growth of vices. The ancients would have insisted that we evaluate our technologies not merely by their efficiency or convenience, but by their effects on human character and their compatibility with the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. Chapter 5: When Philosophy Becomes Ideology, the Betrayal of Wisdom. Here we must examine honestly our own relationship to truth and consider whether we have fallen into the same trap that captured so many of our contemporaries. The ancient philosophers distinguished carefully between philosophy, the love of wisdom that acknowledges its own ignorance and remains open to correction through argument and evidence, and sophistry, the claim to possess wisdom that one does not actually have, usually deployed in service of some practical agenda. This distinction has been almost completely lost in our time, with catastrophic consequences for intellectual life and political discourse. What we call political philosophy today is often nothing more than sophisticated ideology, elaborate rationalizations for positions we have already decided to embrace for non-rational reasons. Whether these positions derive from personal interest, group loyalty, emotional attachment, or simple prejudice matters less than the fact that they are treated as immune from genuine questioning. The ancients would have recognized this immediately as a form of sophistry, regardless of whether it appears in progressive or conservative variants, because it subordinates the pursuit of truth to other goals. True philosophy, as Socrates demonstrated through his life and death, begins with the recognition that we do not know what we think we know, especially about the most important questions of human life. What is justice? What is the best way to live? What form of government is most conducive to human flourishing? How should we balance the competing claims of reason and faith? These questions cannot be answered through ideology or partisan commitment, but only through careful investigation that remains open to wherever the evidence and arguments may lead. The theological political problem that I have spent decades exploring illustrates this difficulty perfectly. Both religious believers and secular rationalists often approach fundamental questions about the relationship between reason and revelation with predetermined conclusions, using philosophical argument merely to defend positions they hold for reasons of faith, tradition, cultural loyalty, or personal preference. But genuine philosophical inquiry requires the courage to follow arguments wherever they lead, even when the destination makes us uncomfortable or forces us to abandon cherished beliefs. This is why the great philosophers wrote esoterically, hiding their most dangerous insights beneath layers of conventional opinion and apparent orthodoxy. They understood that most people, including most intellectuals, are not prepared to engage in truly open inquiry about ultimate questions. Such inquiry is dangerous both to individuals, who might discover that their cherished beliefs are unfounded, and to society, which depends on shared convictions for its stability and cohesion. The art of esoteric writing allows philosophers to communicate with those few readers capable of genuine philosophical investigation while protecting both themselves and society from the potentially destructive effects of unlimited questioning. Our contemporary crisis stems partly from the fact that we have democratized access to philosophical questioning without providing the education necessary to engage in it responsibly. University students are encouraged to question everything, but they are not taught how to distinguish between questions worth asking and questions that lead nowhere, or between skepticism that opens the mind to truth and skepticism that closes it off from any possibility of knowledge. The result is not genuine enlightenment but widespread confusion, relativism, and nihilism. The ancients understood that philosophy is not for everyone, not because some people are inherently inferior, but because philosophical inquiry requires intellectual and moral preparation that few receive and fewer still complete successfully. It demands not only intelligence but also courage, honesty, patience, and a willingness to subordinate personal desires to the pursuit of truth. These virtues must be cultivated through years of disciplined study and practice under the guidance of those who have already made significant progress along the philosophical path. Without such preparation, exposure to philosophical questioning often produces not wisdom but sophisticated ignorance, the illusion of knowledge combined with the loss of whatever genuine insights were contained in traditional beliefs and practices. Chapter 6: The Dangerous Truth About Truth and the Art of Prudent Communication. Having spent my career studying how great philosophers communicated dangerous insights without destroying the social and political conditions necessary for civilized life, I must now address a question that makes many of our contemporaries profoundly uncomfortable. Is truth always beneficial for political society? The modern world operates on the Enlightenment assumption that more truth and transparency necessarily lead to better outcomes, that knowledge is always liberating and that rational inquiry should be unlimited. But the ancient philosophers were far more cautious about this proposition, and their caution may have been wiser than our confidence. Consider what happens when philosophical inquiry undermines the beliefs that hold a community together. If people discover that their inherited traditions are based on claims that cannot be rationally demonstrated, or that their most sacred convictions rest on foundations that crumble under critical examination, does this knowledge make them better citizens or worse ones? The ancient philosophers recognized that most human beings need to believe in something greater than themselves to live meaningful and morally ordered lives. But they also knew that such beliefs cannot withstand unlimited rational scrutiny without losing their power to guide conduct and inspire sacrifice. This creates what I have called the theological-political problem, the permanent tension between the requirements of philosophy and the requirements of political life. Philosophy seeks truth regardless of consequences. It follows arguments wherever they lead and acknowledges no authority except reason itself. Political life, by contrast, requires shared beliefs that may not be strictly true but are necessary for social cohesion, moral education, and the motivation of citizens to fulfill their duties to the common good. The great philosophers found ways to honor both demands through the art of careful communication that reveals different levels of meaning to different kinds of readers. Our contemporary intellectual culture has largely abandoned this wisdom. We assume that complete transparency and unlimited questioning are always beneficial, without considering whether some truths might be too dangerous for public consumption or whether some illusions might be more beneficial than the realities they conceal. The result is often the destruction of beneficial beliefs without their replacement by anything better. When traditional sources of meaning and moral guidance collapse under critical scrutiny, the vacuum is frequently filled not by wisdom but by nihilism, fanaticism, or crude materialism. Consider how this dynamic operates in contemporary academic life. Professors routinely expose their students to philosophical and historical investigations that undermine inherited beliefs about morality, politics, religion, and human nature. Such exposure is defended in the name of intellectual freedom and the pursuit of truth. But little thought is given to what will replace the beliefs that are destroyed, or whether the students possess the intellectual and moral resources necessary to handle such destructive knowledge constructively. The ancient philosophers understood that different truths are appropriate for different audiences. The same insight that might liberate a mature philosopher could destroy a young person not yet prepared to handle it responsibly. This does not mean that truth should be permanently suppressed, but it does mean that those who possess dangerous insights bear special responsibility for how, when, and to whom they communicate them. The art of esoteric writing represents one solution to this problem. By concealing their most radical insights beneath layers of conventional opinion, the great philosophers made it possible for serious readers to discover dangerous truths gradually, through their own efforts, while protecting casual readers from exposure to ideas they were not prepared to handle. Such writing respects both the integrity of philosophical inquiry and the legitimate needs of political society. Perhaps our current crisis will teach us to recover this ancient prudence about the relationship between knowledge and political order. The choice is not between truth and falsehood, but between wise and unwise ways of communicating truth in a world where not everyone is prepared to receive it. Chapter 7: The Return to Greatness Through Great Books and Philosophical Community. After decades of watching students discover the treasures hidden in classical texts, I remain convinced that the path forward from our current cultural crisis requires a return to serious engagement with the greatest works of the human mind. This is not antiquarian nostalgia or romantic escapism, but practical necessity grounded in philosophical realism. The questions that tormented Plato and Aristotle are the same questions that torment us. What is justice? How should we live? What form of government is best? What is the relationship between the individual and the community? What are the possibilities and limits of human reason? The ancients may not have found final answers to these permanent questions, but they developed far more sophisticated ways of thinking about them than anything our contemporary culture has produced. The great books offer something that no amount of contemporary analysis can provide: distance from our own assumptions and prejudices. When we read Aristotle's Politics or Plato's Republic, We encounter minds that approached fundamental questions from radically different starting points than our own. This encounter forces us to examine beliefs we had taken for granted and consider possibilities we had never imagined. Such intellectual liberation is impossible when we confine ourselves to contemporary sources that share our basic presuppositions about human nature, political life, and the cosmos. But reading the classics properly requires cultivation of intellectual and moral virtues that our instant gratification culture actively discourages: patience, humility, precision, and above all, the willingness to struggle with difficult ideas over extended periods of time. The ancients wrote for readers who were prepared to engage in this kind of serious intellectual work. They assumed their audience would read slowly, think carefully, discuss their reading with others, and return repeatedly to the same texts as their understanding deepened and their souls matured. This is why I have always insisted that the art of reading is itself a philosophical discipline. To read Plato properly, you must learn to notice when he has Socrates contradict himself, when he places important arguments in the mouths of questionable characters, when he uses irony to signal that the surface meaning conceals deeper truths, when he employs dramatic elements to convey insights that cannot be stated directly. Such reading requires the same intellectual virtues that philosophy itself requires: precision, subtlety, intellectual courage, and above all, the recognition that the most important insights are often the most carefully hidden. The ultimate goal is not merely to understand what the ancients thought, but to join the conversation they began about the permanent questions of human existence. This conversation represents the highest form of human community, the fellowship of minds across centuries united in the pursuit of wisdom. In such pursuit, we find not only intellectual satisfaction but recovery of our own humanity and our proper place in the cosmic order. Yet this return to the classics cannot be accomplished by individuals working in isolation. Philosophy, as Aristotle taught us, is essentially a social activity. We need communities of serious readers who can challenge and correct each other, who can provide the intellectual and moral support necessary for sustained philosophical inquiry, and who can serve as living examples of what the philosophical life looks like in practice. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the crisis that surrounds us. The enemies of philosophical culture understand something that many of its friends have forgotten: ideas have consequences, and the battle for civilization is ultimately a battle for souls. We cannot defeat sophisticated barbarism through purely defensive measures. We must offer a positive alternative: communities where excellence is recognized and cultivated, where serious questions are pursued seriously, where the young can encounter living examples of intellectual and moral virtue. Such communities will necessarily be small at first, but their influence can extend far beyond their numerical size if they succeed in producing individuals capable of genuine leadership, persons who combine intellectual sophistication with practical wisdom, who understand both the permanent truths about human nature and the particular challenges of their own time and place. Conclusion. The cultural crisis we face today was indeed predicted by the ancient philosophers because they understood something about human nature that modernity chose to forget. We cannot live fully human lives without orientation toward transcendent truth, beauty, and goodness. When philosophical relativism undermines these orientations, when technological acceleration prevents the development of contemplative capacity, when democratic leveling destroys respect for excellence, the result is not liberation but confusion, nihilism, and eventual tyranny disguised as progress. Yet the same classical tradition that predicted our crisis also provides resources for addressing it. Through patient engagement with the great texts of our civilization, through the cultivation of intellectual and moral virtues, through the formation of communities dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom, we can recover the understanding necessary for authentic human flourishing. The choice before us is clear: we can continue down the path of sophisticated barbarism that masquerades as enlightenment, or we can undertake the difficult work of returning to the sources of genuine wisdom. The ancients await our return to the conversation that matters most, the eternal dialogue about what it means to live well in the face of permanent human questions.